So I want to thank you guys for coming out today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather Chancellor McIntosh, and I'm a research statistician with the Office for Research Development and Scholarly Activity. And this is actually the second installment of the Planning Your Research series. So there was one in August that was led by Chan Hellman, and then I'm doing the one this month, and then there will be a third one in October. So the next 3 days we'll be going over the research process from question to analysis. So I'm hoping that this will be very skills-based and as interactive as possible, so it's not just me talking at you for 3 hours. But some of it will be me talking to you, so I apologize for that. I'm also hoping that this is either a refresher on some basic skills you already have, or maybe it's the first time you're being exposed to this information. But regardless, I'm hoping you can take some of this away and apply it in your everyday job. Okay, so like I said, my name is Heather, and I work for the School of Community Medicine. I've been with the university since 2012, and my graduate training is in research, evaluation, measurement, and statistics. So before we jump right in, I want to say thank you to Shelley for putting all of this together, the food and all the admin stuff that goes on the back end that people may not always see. And then also thank you to Chan and his office, or department rather, College of Arts and Sciences, and the Office for VPR. They are the ones who kind of jointly hosted this, and that's why we're all here. So, and thank you guys for being here. Okay, so the goal for today is to think about your work as a scientific question. So a lot of the work we do every single day in all of our jobs can be thought of in a scientific way. It really just requires looking at your work through a different lens, kind of removing yourself as the intervention, the one doing the work, and saying, how would I study this? So if you're in a medical setting, so maybe the treatment you're providing, or if you're in an academic setting, the way you're training your students or the way you're going about your day-to-day job, all of that can be turned into a scientific question and then refined and measured. And you can take that stuff to conferences and write up manuscripts. So really today I just want to give a couple examples of how to think about your work as a scientific question. And then the other thing we'll be doing is developing and refining research questions. So we'll kind of go through that process. And I do want to say as a disclaimer, these are my tools that I use when I'm working on my own projects or when I'm working with faculty, residents, staff, students. Certainly there are many other ways to go about this, so if you have something, please feel free to chime in on what you find to be really helpful. But like I said, these are just things that I've learned in my training and then in working at the university. Okay, so I wanted to define a few terms. You should have received a packet via email that has quite a lot of definitions as well as some of the slides blown up, so you can have that with you forever and always. But I just thought that we could quickly go over the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Are people pretty familiar with these two terms? Okay, so it looks like this is a very research-minded group, so I appreciate that. So quantitative research, the collection and analysis of numerical data. So that's what I do. I deal primarily in quantitative research. A lot of survey research that we do, randomized control trials, that kind of thing. Qualitative research is a completely different process. It is the collection, analysis, and interpretation of narrative or visual data. So this is interviews, focus groups, talking things out, not based on numbers. This is an excellent way to go about researching a topic if that's what you're interested in. And I certainly advocate for anyone who wants to have a qualitative component to do that. If you are going to do that, I highly recommend having someone who's skilled in that area because it is a completely different beast. You don't just go do an interview. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of training, and content analysis can be very difficult. So I think sometimes maybe people think that qualitative isn't as hard for whatever reason, but that's absolutely not the case. So today we will be working, in the next 3 days we'll be focusing on quantitative research because that is my area. If I ever work with you on a project and you say, you want to do a qualitative component, I'll say that's great. Contact a qualitative researcher because I'm not the person to help you with that. So I just wanted to make that distinction before we move any further. Another distinction, I guess, that I wanted to make was the difference between QI and research. So is everyone pretty familiar with these terms? Mostly? Okay. So I don't have program evaluation up here, which I probably should have, but it's very similar to quality improvement. So quality improvement is process-based, so focusing on implementing a change, making a change within a process. And that applies, the highest level of evidence-based practice. Program evaluation is very similar to that. You're looking at a program and deciding if you need to make a change or if you need to cancel the program, and you are interested in utility and feasibility. And you're very specific to your sample. So whatever program or process you want to test and try to implement a change, you're focused on just that one program or process. Research is different in that it's a systematic investigation. It's theory-based. The goal is to seek truth and to ultimately be able to generalize beyond your one sample. So since this series is called Planning Your Research, I bet you can figure out which one we'll be spending our time in. But I did just want to highlight these two, that there are differences. Sometimes people come to me with a project and think they have a research project, but it's really QI, and vice versa. So just knowing the difference, I think, is really helpful. The same with program evaluation. They are very, very different. But some of the steps to implement that kind of project are similar, and that's what we're about to go over. So the PDSA model. Is everyone familiar with PDSA? Okay. For those of you who are not, the PDSA model is basically the scientific method for action-oriented learning and for work-related process change. So the PDSA stands for these 4 steps. So plan, do, study, act. And the definition here, it's used for testing change by planning it, trying it, observing, and acting on what is learned. When we go over the scientific method, you'll see that some of these steps are really embedded within the scientific method, so that's why I wanted to bring this up. This is also a great way to think about your work as a scientific question, even just the way you train people under you. If you have staff under you, you can apply this model to that understanding. So an example of this that I have that's fairly recent, I spend half a day a week in a clinic, an OU clinic. It's for a research project, an RCT that we're working on. But being in the clinic half a day a week, I'm immersed with the nurses and the physicians. Chaos, if you've never been in a clinic. It's very chaotic. But one thing I hear time and time again is that prescriptions can be sometimes a hassle. And patients calling in for a prescription is just kind of an onslaught, nonstop of patients needing their prescriptions, right? And just like us, when we're ready for a prescription, we want it then. So I thought about that problem and how it seems to create a little bit of a burden for the nurses and the physicians. And I thought, I wonder if we could do a quality improvement on this. So what if we looked at the way we're doing prescription workflow now? How does that work? We measure that and we look and see what's going right and wrong and what we think could be changed based on that workflow. Then we say, okay, well, what if we're in the planning stage? Well, what if we've noticed that there's this problem, or maybe it's just not as efficient as we'd like it to be with the prescription workflow. So what if we implemented some kind of process change where prescriptions were only handed out Wednesday and Friday afternoons? So you call in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday morning, you get your prescription Wednesday afternoon. You call in Wednesday afternoon, Thursday, or Friday, you get it Friday afternoon. So that's our new process, right? So we come up with a predetermined amount of time, maybe 6 or 8 weeks, to implement this change. And now we're in the do. So we carry out this plan. And we see how it goes, and we keep track of all of our data and the metrics that we came up with. And then when we move on to the study, we compare that to the old process, and we see what differences are there. And maybe the new process worked better in some ways, maybe it didn't work better at all, or maybe it was just fantastic. So then we move on to the act, and we decide, okay, let's implement this new change. So that's just one example of me being in a clinic and seeing that maybe this could be done a little differently. I don't know, I'm not a physician or a nurse, but maybe we could try it out. So that's PDSA, a very abbreviated version of PDSA, mind you. But that is for quality improvement. And somewhat similarly, you can apply this to program evaluation, although there are many different kinds of program evaluations you can implement. Okay, so the scientific method. This is where we're really going to live for the next 3 days. We're going to be talking about the scientific method as the process for research and why it is so important to think about these steps as you're moving through the research process. So the scientific method is similar to PDSA. It's used to explore observations, though, and answer questions, seek truth, as well as, rely very heavily on theory. So for today, we'll be spending, as we go through the process, we'll be spending our time in the first 3 bubbles. So making an observation, thinking of questions, and formulating a hypothesis or a research question. So those are the first 3 steps. And then tomorrow, we will be at developing testable predictions, how to gather data, and some of the ways to go about doing that. And then on the last day, we'll be analyzing our data and interpreting it and kind of moving around the circle back up to making an observation. So hopefully by the end of the 3 days, you'll be very comfortable with the scientific method and how it applies to the research process. And I'll be referring back to it on my little sheet of paper. So. Okay, so in making an observation, this is something that you can do all the time, all around you in your everyday life. What's going on in your field, what's going on in your current environment. Then the next step is to think about, why does this happen? Is there a causal relationship here? This is the point that you might turn to the literature and see what's been done about this particular phenomenon that you're interested in. Then you develop a question that is actually in a research format, not just why does this happen? And then you move on to, okay, well, if I have this question, then these are the measures that I'm interested in. These are the variables. This is how I plan to test this question. And then this is what I expect to be the outcome of this project. You gather the data. That's the fun part, right? And then you analyze it and interpret it, and hopefully your results yield something fantastic and you're really excited about it and you write up a paper. Okay, so that's this process that we're going to be working through over the next few days. Okay, so first just want to say that dog is awesome, so we'll get to that story in a minute. Selecting a research topic. Okay, so all of you have said that you're comfortable or that you're very interested in research, so hopefully you know that research takes time, especially a quality project. It takes time. It's not something that can be done inside of a month, your IRB approval is going to take a month. So this process takes a lot of time. And in selecting a topic of interest, these are my kind of tips on how to go about doing that. Your experience. What's going on around you? What's going on in your field? What do you do every day? Or what have you noticed as a pattern in your life? So your experience in life. Also, what are you interested in? Like I said, research takes time. So if you're going to devote this amount of time, and it's a lot of work, it should probably be something that you're interested in, something that you're passionate about, something that you want to get up in the morning and go study this. And that's where Charles comes in, so don't worry. The next is theory. So after you've come up with an idea and you think, yes, I I've seen this pattern multiple times. I really want to study this. This seems interesting. I wonder if anything has been done about this. You turn to the literature to see what's been done in this particular field of study. You've hopefully, find some theories that are out there. Maybe you find a gaping hole in the literature and you think, oh, my study will contribute to that. Or maybe there's been a lot of work done on this area, but not in this one special way that you're interested in. So here in just a second, we'll get on the library's website and do a couple of quick lit searches. You probably have all done it before, but that's part of my presentation, so you'll just have to do it again. So, okay, now to the story about Charles. So this is my dog. He's obviously a witch pumpkin, which is amazing. But there's actually a really interesting story about how Charles became my dog, and I'll try not to spend too much time on it, although over the next 3 days you'll discover that I really like dogs. So just stop me if I'm rambling about my dogs. Okay, so before I worked at OU, I worked at a nonprofit agency here in Tulsa with homeless youth, and it was a great job. We had a center where the kids could come. They could get a hot meal, they could take a shower, get clothes. We also helped them prep for life, so maybe setting up for a GED class, or getting a job, or getting some of the things that we might take for granted, like identification or a social security card. These kids didn't have that. So this is what our center did. But they also could just come and hang out, and we'd play games with them, and they could have a normal kind of interaction, healthy interaction with people. So the kids would come, I call them kids, but they were young adults. They would come in, and they always had dogs with them. And it was really awesome because I love dogs, but then it was also really sad because of the situation that the young person was in. So these are people who are sleeping under bridges or couch surfing or, doing whatever they can to survive. So taking a dog to the vet, absolutely out of the question. They can't even take themselves to the doctor or, do the things that, like I said, we all take for granted. And inevitably, every time, the kid would bring the dog in, get really attached to the animal, and then the animal would die because the kid couldn't care for the animal. Parvo, get hit by a car, poor nutrition. And then the story's going really sad fast, but that was really the nature of the situation, was that the kids would be super attached to these animals because this was something that loved them unconditionally, that was with them all the time, wherever they were, because these kids walked around all the time or slept under bridges and the dogs could be with them. And so they created this instant bond just like that. And then when the dog died, it was devastating for the young person, but then they had to quickly rebound in order to survive. Okay, so Charles comes in one day with one of my favorite young people. His name wasn't Charles at the time, it was Scrappy. And I convinced this young person, let me take this dog. I really want this dog. I'll give it a good life. I'll still send you pictures, you can be the surrogate dad, all this stuff, And so I get Charles home on a Friday evening, and I get home at 5:30. By 6, I'm attached to this dog. I cannot imagine my life without Charles, okay? So take him to the vet, everything checks out. He's only 10 weeks old, a little guy. And then go to work, and I'm telling my young person about, I renamed him Charles, and I have pictures and all this stuff. Well, Wednesday, Charles is sick and has to go to the ER. And he had contracted parvo already and probably would have died. So I'm really glad that I have him. But in this experience, being so quickly attached to Charles and seeing how the young person was so quickly attached and how hard it was for them to give him up made me think about the human-animal bond and that connection and how it forms so quickly and how important that is for homeless youth who have nothing, but they have this creature who loves them. And so I thought, I want to study this. There has to be something here because I worked in the nonprofit sector for a while and I constantly saw dogs in and out. And there were some older homeless people who had maintained their dog and were able to live with it for a long time. And I thought, there's got to be something here. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to study the human-animal bond and how quickly it forms and how important it is to those who, to all of us. If we have pets, you love your pets, dog, cat, iguana, whatever. But for this young person, how quickly that relationship was so very important and was what they needed. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to study this. So I started to do a library search. So that's an example of how everyday patterns, things you notice, because I kept seeing the dogs coming in and I kept noticing the bonds. And then I realized my own bond was so instant that I thought there's got to be something here. In the general population, yes, but within the homeless population. So how to do a lit search on that. So everyone, if you can, pull up your library link. Okay, does everyone have the library pulled up to something like this? Okay. So you can do a lit search two ways. You can, one, do it yourself, and you can, two, ask the library to do it. I advocate doing both because it's so important, I think, to own your study and to understand the importance of the literature that's gone on before you, because you're likely not the first person to think of this idea, although maybe you are. But I think it's really important because it provides ownership, and you had to put that work in, so that saying, you know, when you work for something, you care about it more or whatever. So I think you should always do a lit search on your own. And then ask the library to help you because they are awesome and they like doing them. Or at least I think they like doing them, and they may find something that you didn't find. So since I think everyone knows how to do this, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but to do it your own way, you go to the library databases, and I'm going to click on bird, and then they're listed there. I mean, it really couldn't be, you know, any simpler. So I like EBSCO. I use that one a lot. But you can use whatever one you want. And I'm just going to go through it quickly. So I select all of them. That's a lot, I know. And then here you can do like human. Okay, human-animal bond. Okay, so 7,436. That's an awful lot of articles to go through. I'd probably reduce that down. If I'm interested in homelessness, I would put homeless human and animal bond or something like that. But just an example of how to look for something via your own search. And then you can also have the library do it, of course. So if you just go back to the main library page, you can just click request a lit search here. And it's just a very simple Qualtrics. It takes, 3 minutes to do if you know what you're kind of interested in. So I say put everything in there and separate it with commas, and the library will help sort it out for you. So those are examples of how to do lit searches. So selecting a research topic, experience or interest, dogs, homelessness also, and then turning to the literature to see what's out there, what's been done on this, and then moving on to developing your research question. Okay, so when I meet with faculty and residents or students, the first thing I ask is, okay, well, what's your research question? Like the very first thing, typically. And I get a lot of, I don't know, I want to study this. And that's okay. But developing a strong research question is so very important. Everything tethers back to your question. Any barriers you hit along the way or roadblocks, we're always going to go back to, okay, well, what was our research question? What did we set out to study here? So having a strong research question is so vitally important to having a quality project. And this process takes time. So what I first tell people to do is write it out. Whatever you're interested in, write the content down on paper. Don't worry about it being grammatically correct or even being in complete sentences. That original idea is probably not what is going to make it to the manuscript. Like, I'll just put that out there. It's probably going to take many, many revisions and your project will evolve before you even get to the point of writing up a paper. So I think this can sometimes intimidate people, or people feel blocked out by not having the perfect thing to write down at the very first time, but that is just really not important at this stage. I think what's most important is writing it down on paper and just getting your thoughts out of your head, because what's in your head and then seeing it on paper, they can be very different. So write it out. The next thing I think is talk it over. So find colleagues that have similar interests. If you're junior faculty, find a senior faculty member. If you have someone that has a similar interest in whatever you're interested in, then talk to them. Talk to a GA, or talk to a research assistant, or talk to whoever you have that's available to you. These people will help you come up with new ideas, new ways to look at your project, just new perspectives. And I think that, there's so much talent on this campus that there's really no reason to do an entire project by yourself or just with your own little circle of 1 or 2 people. So really reach out and see, maybe you have a really great idea and then you find out that someone's doing something similar to it. Maybe you can collaborate. So, they say 2 heads are better than 1. Well, 3 or 4 heads are going to be better than 1 or 2. So I say talk it over with as many people as you can. And then once you've kind of developed just this, it's still pretty abstract, but a general idea of what you're interested in, it's time to refine. So we're going to go over how to do that. But I put that 3 times because it does take so many times to refine your question. And that's really important and necessary. Like I said, a strong research question is really the foundation of a good project, and everything comes back to that. So any barrier or roadblock, like I said, that you hit, if you're working with someone like a statistician or a methodologist or a more advanced researcher, they're going to say, well, what was your question? It always comes back to your question. So take that time on the front end, or for those of you who I know work with faculty, encourage them to take that time on the front end, because sometimes they can get in a rush too, I think, because they want to do their study. They want to present. They want to do the fun part, but this isn't the very attractive part, but this really does have a huge impact on the level of quality that you have. The last little comment I have here is your research question should drive your methodology. So kind of in line with what I've already said, but it's not really good practice to go out and say, I want to do this exact analysis on this exact thing, and what kind of research question can I develop because of that? Or I want to do a randomized control trial. I don't care what we do, but I want to do that. Well, is that the most appropriate thing to do based on your topic, right? So start with the question. Start with your idea. Everything else will flow from that. A lot of people don't like hearing that either, but it's really important to have a strong question. Okay, so these are just some example ideas. They're projects that I've worked on, and we're going to work on that first bullet. As you can see, not complete sentences, just words. And we are going to work through how to possibly develop a research question. So we're going to start with the volunteers and sympathy and contact and attitudes toward homelessness. And then if we have time, which maybe we will, we can work through the other 2 ideas. Okay. When you're developing your research question, these questions are going to be in any good intro to research book you will ever find, probably. The 5 W's and how. So these are questions you should ask yourself when you have an idea of when you want to study something. Who do you want to study? What do you want to study? When, where, why, and how? So in thinking about this, volunteers, let me set the stage a little bit more for this. So I did a study a few years ago on volunteers working with the homeless and their attitudes toward the homeless. And I had this idea that contact with volunteers and the different types of contact might lend to more positive attitudes toward the homeless. More specifically, that if you are around the homeless and you get to know them, maybe you're less likely to attribute their situation to something negative about them and more to situational circumstances that perhaps they couldn't control. But just this idea that maybe homelessness is a systems, problem and not an individual problem. That was kind of my general idea. So I thought, okay, well, I wonder if contact will have an impact on that, the type of contact that one has with someone who's homeless. And I want to look specifically at volunteers because I was interested in volunteering and why people choose to volunteer. I was also interested in their inherent levels of sympathy. So that's the stage for this idea. So this is where it can be interactive if you so choose. Okay, so who do we want to study?
Volunteers.
Volunteers, yes. Okay, thank you. And in this case, I specifically was interested in volunteers who volunteered with the homeless. What are we interested in?
Attitudes.
Yeah, their attitudes towards homelessness, maybe their inherent sympathy levels, also maybe some demographic information on them, and maybe the amount of contact they have and the type of contact they have with the homeless. Okay, I didn't answer this, but when do we want to study them?
Tomorrow, over the holidays.
Tomorrow, over the holidays. Okay, why over the holidays?
Just because a lot more people, it's like you're reminded that you're supposed to be charitable and giving, so maybe it would, have an effect or something.
No, that's actually a really good point, and my study ended up being over the holidays. Not thinking about that on the front end, but it actually worked to my advantage because I had a huge number of volunteers. Okay, so, time of year would fall on that when. Maybe also when are we going to study them? So probably while they're at their volunteering shift, so we're not trying to track them down. So when they're volunteering, we want to study their attitudes towards the homeless, specifically with volunteers who work with the homeless. Where do we want to study these people?
Shelter.
Yeah, at a shelter, okay. Maybe at a Tulsa shelter and not Oklahoma City or not Lawton or not. So these seem obvious, but you'll be very surprised how much people don't think about this stuff and how it can really help. Just by answering these questions, it can help you refine your idea down, drill down to what you're really interested in. Because now already we know that we want to study, we've already answered the top three, but that we want to study them while they're at a shelter, a nonprofit, wherever they're volunteering. So maybe the Day Center or Iron Gate or Youth Services or somewhere like that. Why do we want to study them? So because we're interested, because we care about this, because it's meaningful to us, or it's the field that we work in, and maybe there's gaps in the literature, and so we want to understand this volunteering, what compels people to volunteer with the homeless, stuff like that. And then how? So do we want to focus group these people? Do we want to one-on-one interview with them? Just want to give a survey? So just by answering these 6 questions here has already helped you really narrow down your idea and has brought some kind of real life substance to the idea. It's not just this abstract thing anymore. It's still kind of abstract, but you're a lot closer to a question than you were before you went through these. Again, this is not the only way to get to a research question. This is just something that I do when I'm studying my own stuff and when I work with people. We try to go over these questions. The other thing is working smart. So this acronym is used all over the place, but it stands for being specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So specificity is really huge, knowing exactly who you want to study and where and why. Is it measurable? Asking why do volunteers volunteer with the homeless, or does sympathy play into that at all? That's not really measurable. Those are just kind of generic questions that still need to be drilled down to an actual research question. Is it attainable? So is it something that that you can actually do. Do you have a relationship with a nonprofit here in town who would give you access to their volunteers? Because that's huge right there, just having the accessibility of it. So that can stop you right there. I worked on a study recently with someone, and they wanted to work with an agency that was really difficult to get through to. And we were realizing that it was going to take some time to get where we needed to be with this agency. And we just decided as a team that, you know what, this is not going to work. This is not going to be realistic or timely or attainable, because this agency kept throwing up barriers, and we thought, okay, well, we'll still study what we want to study, but we're going to find an alternate route to do that. So these are really good tactics, questions to ask yourself when you're coming up with a question. I know that there are coordinators in the audience who do this with their faculty and residents, and I think that it's been really helpful. So it's a good thing, but you can find this, a lot of literature on this specific method of working smart. Realistic is also huge too. So is it something that you can do based on your skill set? So, I have faculty sometimes that I work with who want to do this really great project, but then it's maybe 5 projects away from where we really are. So what is your skill set? What do you have time to do? Is it realistic to you and all of your other responsibilities? And then lastly is timely. So, is it something that you can do in a reasonable amount of time? Is it something that that isn't going to take, many, many years to do, and maybe you're not going to be able to devote that much time? So back to my dog example, I wanted to look at the animal-human bond among homeless people who have dogs. When I started thinking in these terms, it was a struggle. By the time I was ready to start with data collection, it was getting cold outside. So in working with a transient population, finding them in the cold is even more difficult than in the spring and summer. And then realizing how many people actually have dogs. Like, I have no idea the time it would take to just figure out how many people who are homeless have had a dog or currently have a dog. It was getting less and less attainable. And then for this particular project, I was finishing up my master's, so this was going to be my master's thesis, and I also wanted to graduate. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to table this idea and do something that's a little bit more realistic and something that I can do in the time that I have, because at this point it was, October, and I wanted to graduate in May. So these are really great steps to go through as you're developing your question, or as you're working with faculty or other staff who are working on a research question. Okay, so this is just an awesome picture that I took. So we've talked about thinking about your work in a scientific way. We've talked about once you have an idea, what to do with that idea. So you have come up with this idea based on your experience or the field of study you're in. So you turn to the literature and you find out this information, and there's a hole in the literature and you want to fill it with your awesome idea. So you start to work through those steps of working smart and the 5 W's and how, and start answering your questions. But we still at this point don't have a solid measurable research question. We're still just working through what that's going to look like. So the next slide we'll get to in just a second, but I want to talk a little bit about the volunteer study. So we know we want to study volunteers. We know we want to look at their levels of contact and the type of contact they have. And we know that we want to study them while they're volunteering and maybe during the holidays or something like that. So how do we put all this stuff into research question format? So this next slide are research questions. They're very basic, but they're a template for what you can do to start. I developed these a few years ago, and actually I know Eden uses them with her faculty and staff, and it's been very helpful. But these are just bare minimum research questions. So they are not sophisticated, and they're certainly not the end-all for developing a question. But it is a way to, these are different templates, a way to think about your work in a measurable way. So putting your idea and seeing if what you want to study fits into these questions. And then once you have a general idea of what you are interested in, you find a question, you're like, yeah, I do want to know the relationship between the level of contact with the homeless and a volunteer's attitudes toward the homeless. That makes sense. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in that relationship. If you have one of these template questions with your stuff filled in there, and you take this to a statistician or to a methodologist, they're going to know what you're wanting to study pretty much immediately. They're going to say, okay, so they'll look at that. Well, that's your dependent variable. That's your independent variable. You need to measure this. This is like speaking our language. So again, very basic, not a comprehensive list, but just something that I came up with because when I'm meeting with faculty and when I'm meeting with residents or whoever, and they tell me their ideas, I'm writing down what they're saying in this format on my own. And I flip the paper around and I say, are you talking about this? And they say yes or no or whatever. And then we figure out what they're really wanting to study. So this should be in your packet. I think this will be helpful. And if nothing else, it will give you an idea of how to just start thinking about your question in a way that makes sense to you. So, like I said, what is the relationship between the level of sympathy or the number of contact hours a volunteer might have and their attitudes toward the homeless? Or is there a difference in attitudes toward the homeless based on one's inherent sympathy? So just taking your ideas and kind of seeing if they fit in, you're not modifying your idea to fit something that's not your idea at this point. You already have your question. You just don't have it in a format that might be measurable or that might make sense to someone who will then help you measure it. Okay, so the things we talked about today, thinking about your work as a scientific question. So, like I said, removing yourself from the actual work you do every day and just adding that extra lens and thinking about how would I study this or how could this be done? And then following the steps of the scientific method. So today we worked through the first 3 on my little sheet of paper here. We have kind of a basic research question, a general idea about the relationship between contact hours and attitudes toward the homeless, but understanding that this is really the process for research. So this should be your friend, the scientific method. And then just a good sage piece of advice, referring to the literature. If you think you have something that you really want to study, look and see what's been done on it. That's really helpful to inform your own study. And I think this step gets overlooked quite a bit because they're not fun sometimes doing lit searches. I don't know anyone who just super loves to sit down and go through a bunch of papers except for librarians, and that's why we have them. And we're so thankful for them. But I think because this is not a super fun thing to do, it gets skipped over a lot. Yeah. So again, I work for ORDSA. This is just my little bit about what we do. If you are in College of Medicine or Public Health or even HSC, we will work with you on your project. If you're in a Norman-based program, you can still contact me at this contact information, and I can help you find someone in your area who is skilled at that. Norman operates a little bit differently than HSC. We all have coordinators who work in the departments, and I know that isn't always the case in Norman, but if you are interested in working on a project and you're not really sure where to start, then I certainly don't mind helping with that because I really want to promote the research agenda here at the university. So that's important to me. So does anyone have any questions? You all already knew all of this and you just got a free lunch, hopefully. And maybe it refreshed some information for you. If you're able to come back tomorrow, and I hope that you are, we'll be talking more about defining variables and how to choose the right data that matches your question. So these 3 seminars or workshops, they're designed to stand alone, and they will, but they do build on each other. So we'll spend a little bit of time just recapping what we went over today. But I hope you're back tomorrow, because we'll go over the variables, like I said, and data and SPSS a very little bit amount. And then Thursday we will be working in SPSS and doing some analyses, and we'll also talk about how to determine which analysis to use based on your question. So I think that could be really helpful. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Thanks to Shelly again for setting everything up. And thanks for spending your lunch with me. So.